week 2 of content. We will be focusing this week on facial expressions, which is going to be chapter 2. So when we first think of facial expressions, we tend to think of the idea of physical attractiveness or the role of person's appearance dealing with facial expressions. Now, I want you to focus your attention this week not necessarily on eye contact, which we have an entire chapter for next week, but specifically looking at 3 different areas of the face, right? Moving from the forehead and brows to the kind of eye area or bridge of the nose and the lower area of the face, okay? Now, the main thing when we think of facial expressions, we tend to think of a positive expression such as smiling. There are 2 different types of smiles that are discussed in the textbook. The first one is felt smiles, which are the genuine smiles that you give to people. They're relatively short, lasting only a few seconds. False smiles, on the other hand, are the smiles that, somebody makes a joke and you don't really think it's all that funny. So, you kind of ha-ha. They tend to be either shorter than real smiles, or they tend to last a lot longer, which is a way to kind of signify whether or not it's an actual genuine smile. Now, when we talk about facial expressions, what we're really looking at is our emotional expression. So the textbook talks about what is emotion, right? Being that it's a short term, it's something that is felt or experienced within. We talk about it from more of a psychological perspective in the textbook. At this point, I feel confident that you probably understand what an emotion is, whether it's a positive emotion such as happiness or love, or a negative emotion such as shame or anger. Ultimately, successful communication is going to depend on our ability to decipher other people's emotional states, whether they're broad emotional states, right, the general emotions that people have, or also specific emotions. And specific emotions are often, they're subtle, they're fleeting, they don't stay on a person's face for long periods of time, so we need to be really in tune to these fleeting emotions and be able to pick up on that, okay? In this chapter, there are 2 big perspectives on facial expressions. And I'm going to spend some time talking about these because I think this is kind of where the challenging portion of this chapter is. So starting on page 28, they talk about the categoric perspective, and then we'll move on to the dimensional perspective. Ultimately, the overlying premise of the categoric perspective is that at any given time, we just have one dominant emotion that we express on our face. Now, we go to talk about Tompkins, where he sets up several different categories, anywhere from the interest, excitement, down to contempt or disgust, right? And we're considering those to be one dominant emotion, just depending on how we're going to label it. What they argue in this perspective is ultimately that our expectations of these emotions ultimately produce them on our face. So they will say that we experience this emotion prior to expressing it. And I'm sure some of you have heard the research that you can actually switch this, right? So you can put a smile on your face and actually convince yourself that you are happy. This perspective is going to argue that no, it comes first. The emotion comes first, and then we learn to express it. One of the most well-known scholars on facial expressions is Ekman. And Ekman falls into the categorical perspective. What he argues for is that we have 7 different classes of facial expressions, and these are listed in the textbook on page 28. And what he argues is that these are universal across culture. Okay, so he has done a lot of research looking at the different muscles in the face and how we can only express certain emotions based on the limitations with what muscles we actually have. Now, when he talks about them being universal, what he's saying is that across cultures, globally, right, we can see someone smiling or we can see somebody expressing anger or frustration and be able to pick these emotions out. What he does note is that some cultures are more skilled at distinguishing these emotions. Specifically, the American culture has a really hard time distinguishing between disgust and contempt. So he groups them as one emotion. Okay. Now, is this factual? Right? Just because he's arguing that it's universal and he spent his life studying it doesn't mean, again, that this is a truth. And I want to stress that. I mentioned last week, or potentially you could be watching these at relatively the same time, that this is a social science. So we do not have facts. So I don't want you to say we have, 7 classes of facial expressions, and these are universal across, all cultures, as this is some type of truth. But there's a lot of strength in that argument. As I stressed earlier, when we talk about facial expressions, we're talking about which part of the face they are expressed on, which brings me to the topic of what happens with all of the plastic surgery that's going on. And we really haven't studied this. They start to talk about this on page 30 when they're talking about the different areas of the face, and then, I'm jumping ahead here and letting you know, on page 47, they talk about the issue of facial implants and Botox. My forehead moves. My eyebrows move. I don't have Botox, but a lot of people nowadays, their forehead does not move, right? Or what happens when you get a facelift, or your face is more, or I should say less expressive because it's tighter, the skin is tighter. And what happens with that? Are we able then to be able to decode the emotions that these people are expressing? So that's something to consider that really there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to that. Clearly, as that's more of a cosmetic social issue and it's becoming more prevalent, how then will we be able to decipher emotions? So the next perspective is dimensional, and dimensional really argues that we don't just have one dominant emotion that we're displaying on our face at any given time, that we really have a number of different dimensions within that emotion. And that really addresses kind of the fleeting or the subtleties. And perhaps, right, this idea that the emotion might not come before the expression, right? The expression might come before the emotion, or we ourselves might not really realize what emotion we are feeling at any given time. I'm sure that you have been on a roller coaster and you felt excitement and fear at the same time, maybe a little bit of nervousness, and maybe you were sick to your stomach. Maybe it was pure terror. How can we have all these emotions at one given time? And if you have been on a roller coaster, say at Cedar Point, they take those pictures of you at the end, which are always ridiculous. Your hair is flying, right? Hopefully your shirt isn't flying, but they take these pictures of you, and at that moment, they capture, right, all of those emotions. And that's really what this dimensional perspective is saying. The categoric is saying, wait a minute, how, if I look at that picture at the end of a roller coaster, can I say that that is only fear or it is only excitement, right? When really it could be a multitude of dimensions. So in the end, they kind of argue that there's about 6 different dimensions for it. And this is built from Osgood on. But ultimately, what's important with that is that these different dimensions really address 5 major concerns about the face. And they argue that the face communicates these 5 things. The face communicates our evaluation judgments. So whether we like something or whether we dislike something. The face also communicates our interest in something or our disinterest in it. The face also communicates the degree that we're involved in the situation. So are we paying attention to things? Are we not paying attention? The face also communicates the amount of control we have over our facial expressions. Some people have tics. Some people aren't aware of the facial expressions. I've already noted probably in both of the first 2 videos that I have these crazy eyes. I also have jazz hands, which you're not able to see as much given you only get the top portion of my body. But until you see that, you don't really necessarily know, can you control these things? Do you even do these things? And the last one is the face communicates how much we understand what's going on in the situation or the topic. I'm sure you've looked at somebody and they've had this kind of confused look on their face, right? Versus the daze, which would indicate that they're not interested in what's going on. But our emotions, right, our feelings, our thoughts on things are really argued to be written all over our face. The key thing is, are we actually paying attention to that? Are you picking up on that? We do notice it in other people, but do we notice what our own face is doing? Have you ever thought about looking into a mirror, talking to yourself, right? What happens with that is that we will self-correct. So if I watch myself on the screen right now, which I'm trying not to do, I'm either looking at the notes or looking at the little tiny camera at the top, if I notice myself or pay attention to myself, I will self-correct. I will fix the crazy eyes, right? I will, smile more, do all of those things to appear more positive. However, right? When I videotape myself and watch myself back, I will start to pick up on that. So the key thing, if you would like to say, I don't know what my face does, because I don't walk around with a mirror, is actually videotape yourself. Don't just look at yourself in the mirror because you'll self-correct, but actually watch it. And this is a lot of times if you've taken a public speaking class, what your instructors will advise you to do is record yourself so you don't self-correct. The kind of final portion of this chapter, I'm trying to keep this one relatively simple, talks about some of the different research findings. And these are probably the most interesting portion. The categoric and the dimensional are probably the challenging portion. But moving on to the research findings, on page 33, they talk about which side of the face more accurately displays our real emotion. And they talk about how the left side is actually where our emotions are more intensely expressed, which would ultimately mean that the right side of our brain controls that. And this is interesting because, my assumption has always been that the face is relatively symmetrical. So if I smile with both sides of my face, right? But what they argue is that we kind of, we do these we half smiles or half pouts, or, one eyebrow goes up, or, one eye is half closed. And we do things like that to kind of indicate our real emotional expression. So if you want to find out how somebody really feels, they argue, or research argues, that you should look at the left side of the face. Another research finding addressed on page 44 and 45 is this importance of facial recognition. They talk about how human beings are really inept at remembering people's faces. Now, we can't always put a name with it. If you've ever seen somebody, you thought, I know that person. I don't know where I know that person or how I know that person, but I do know I know that person. That's an idea that we can remember people's faces, okay? To remember names with that is a totally different issue. What research finds is that, or what they're arguing for, is that we really need to come up with a better way to describe the structure of the face. When you talk about eyewitness testimony, people will say they had big eyes, or they had a hook nose, or they had a round face, or they had a, double chin. But we really need to be able to kind of decipher the different structure, right? To be able to describe it, to be more accurate with some of, with the when people do the drawings of criminals or whatnot. Another issue that they talk about on page 35 and 36 is this idea of display rules. So what facial expressions are appropriate to display at any given time? There are three major areas. They talk about personal display rules. So with whom can you display for certain facial expressions, right? We are much more animated when we talk to children, and we'll do those big eyes and we get really excited, or, smile more, or even get angrier at them and really show them, we are upset with you. We might, shake our finger at them using a gesture, but we can also kind of turn down our eyes to them, right? And kind of pull in our face to tighten it to be like, we are upset with you. Now, the situational display rules indicate that there are certain facial expressions that are appropriate to display in certain situations. Makes sense, right? When you're at the workplace, you can't, get all angry and you get heated, or, throw your temper tantrum. You realize that in a professional setting that you are going to not only dress appropriately, but act appropriately and display appropriate facial expressions, such as smiling or positive facial expressions. And the last set of display rules is the cultural aspect, and that really deals with specific cultures. When we think of cultures, we think of broad cultures, right? I am an American, right? I am a woman. And what we also need to think of is different subcultures that we are a part of, right? I am in my 30s, so I'm from a certain generation, right? Same thing with you. You are a college student, no matter what your age is now, right? You come from a certain race or ethnicity, a certain religion, a certain socioeconomic status, right? You may be homosexual, heterosexual. All of these things are subcultures, and within our subcultures, or cultural groups, there are certain rules that, or certain facial expressions that we can display and certain ones that we cannot, especially publicly. With the idea that we can display certain facial expressions or recognize that we do have different display rules, we realize that we can manipulate our facial expressions. The idea that we can manipulate our facial expressions means that we can mislead people. And that's where people sometimes have issue with it, right? We want genuine emotion. We want people to explain to us and also demonstrate real facial expressions. And what we call those as representational expressions. We dislike people who use these presentation expressions. Presentation expressions are the consciously controlled facial expressions. The ones that we strategically put on, I call it the fake smile, right? Like, ha, 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 or the weird wink, and you're like, this is awkward. Clearly you thought to do that, right? We think that those are disingenuous because they are controlled or contrived, and then we therefore believe they're manipulated. Sometimes they're appropriate, as in different contexts for display rules, but when they come from an outsider, we tend to distrust those. We look for specific things, right? When we don't trust a facial expression, we're looking for things like, did they lack spontaneity? Did it seem contrived, right? Does it not sync with the words that they're saying? So, are you saying, I'm really mad at you and smiling? Or are you saying, no, it's fine, while you're, doing your little tit with your nose, okay, and your head? And then also, we don't trust facial expressions if they involve more calculated movement in actually the lower part of the face, okay? This is what we distrust, and that kind of goes back to that fake smile, right? We don't believe that. If you can manipulate the bottom part of your face, we believe, and we'll talk about this next week, that the truth lies somewhere in the eyes, right? That you can't fake that we can see into it for many reasons. The last portion that I want to address is on page 46 through 48, and that's this idea of the accuracy in encoding and decoding messages. People believe that if you're good at encoding facial expressions, right, so that means you're good at actually creating them yourself, because if you're an encoder, you're the sender. You're also then good at decoding other people's, right, and figuring out what they're feeling. And we believe this because if we think people are similar to us, right, they work the same job, they're the same age, right, that the expressions that we encode, right, to mean happiness or sadness or shame or guilt or anger would be the same things that somebody else similar to us would. So when I see and I say, oh, I'm happy, so I smile, and then I see somebody else smiling, I believe what that means happiness. But research has found that there is no link between that. Even if I'm really good at, being accurate in encoding my own facial expressions, it does not mean that I will be accurate at decoding other people's. There's not a link to that, okay? So this brings me to my final point for this chapter and the paper topic for this week. On page 48, they talk about this issue of decoding facial expressions. And they specifically talk about how certain groups, right, are less accurate at decoding facial expressions. Specifically, men, very young people, old people, strangers, juvenile delinquents, right, adolescents. They list quite a few there. And what I want you to do for your paper is give me some reasons, some speculations as to why that may be the case. Why would, culturally, let's stick within what your knowledge base and what you've read in this chapter, why would these groups be less accurate at deciphering or distinguishing facial expressions and what they mean? Is it because they don't have to, right? Is there something about these specific groups that are taught or learned in our culture, right? So for your paper, I want you to put your researcher hat on and come up with different reasons, right, or explanations, and this is all speculation, the book does not give you reasons to go off of, to why these groups would be less accurate at decoding facial expressions. And finally, I want you to speculate as to are there other groups out there that you think are not addressed in this textbook that are also less accurate at deciphering facial expressions? Did some of them they miss? So that is your challenge for the paper. Next week, we will be talking about eye contact, and we'll be going into great detail about that. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I will talk to you next week.